scholars, co-workers on the path. It is a great fortune, a great opportunity for me to be able to speak at such a great institute, and all credit goes to Dr. Sampadananda Misra, who has been a friend for a long time and who has very kindly allowed me or invited me to speak a few words here. Now, you know, the title is very vast and it is not possible to cover all the areas, but I will focus on certain things which will help in further research in the areas, because quite a few students have worked under me. Uh, Madhumita has worked under me, Rima has worked under me, then Shubham Datta has worked under me, Devapriya Goswami has worked under me. So, and many will be in fact benefited by if I can give some new clues to linking the two, one of the two makers of modern Indian tradition. So let me start from Sri Aurobindo's own words on Sri Aurobindo's own words, very compressed, very relevant, and maybe one of the best critics of Rabindranath Tagore is Sri Aurobindo. One of the most relevant, because he speaks in a very apophthegmatic way, in a very epigrammatic way, and in his own characteristic brief style. It's not difficult to, it is difficult to understand what really Sri Aurobindo means about Tagore, but it's quite a big praise, I must say. Quite a big praise. And in fact, he considers him one of the three pioneers of poetry which has taken a new turn towards mantra of the real. Now, Sri Aurobindo uses two terms. Let me go by Sri Aurobindo's own terms first. Then I will come to my theoretical part, which is from Nalinikanta Gupta. Sri Aurobindo says that in Tagore there is that discovery and fusion. So what is discovery? And it relates to Sri Aurobindo's theory of poetry, that the best poetry, the real poetry, is a rhythmic voyage of self-discovery. It rises in the heart of the seer. And it is something different from what we know as poetry today. It's not a notch girl of the mind. So discovery, we understand. Then he speaks of fusion. And this fusion may mean many things, but if you go by the philosophy of the two great minds and the makers of modern Indian tradition, then we can link them also with reference to their integral approach to life. Both are integral thinkers. So fusion is integrating earth and the divine, integrating material life and spiritual life. So this is an interesting opening, because interestingly enough, before Sri Aurobindo started practicing this poetry, Tagore had already started practicing this poetry. Sri Aurobindo came as a theoretician to say, and later he practiced it, this new poetry. And of course there was Whitman behind. And then he speaks of overpassing of the borders. Now my title is On the Borderline and Across the Border. Now Nalinikanta Gupta has differentiated between mystic poetry and spiritual poetry proper. Mystic poetry is on the borderline of truth. It is not the whole vision of truth. It sees some lights, some flickers, some of the colors, lights, messages come through from across the border. But spiritual poetry is bare, it is the direct sight of truth, like we have seen in the Upanishads. And to the modern mind, they are not quite interesting. That is one reason why the poetry of the Upanishads and the poetry of Sri Aurobindo still is not quite popular. Just because of this, because they see the direct vision of truth, and they are sometimes not very interesting to us because our consciousness is not lifted to their level. So there's a kind of boredom in this, whereas mystic poets are very attractive. And I must say Tagore's popularity is due to this, because he's close to us. And Nolinikanta Gupta has very rightly placed him, very interestingly. He is in between man and the Rishi. He is neither a full-grown Rishi nor a man proper. He has gone beyond man, but yet to achieve the status of a Rishi. So he is in between man and Rishi. Very interesting comment about perhaps the best characterizing of the consciousness of Tagore. And of course, he was one of the great seers, Nolinikanta Gupta, one of the 5 great critics in Bengali literature, and one of the leading critics of Indian English literature, but very few people know him, and he is not in academics. Then, about this overpassing of the borders, I beg to contradict with Nolinikanta Gupta a bit, because he has missed perhaps or forgotten that Sri Aurobindo has said overpassing of the borders sometimes. And what is that? Because sometimes Tagore comes very close to spiritual poetry. And I will give one example, because Tagore's songs, at least half of his songs, are remarkable stuff in world literature, and poetry of magic, poetry of revelation, poetry of vision, all that relate to the highest kind of poetry. And so I will just read out a very small song from Tagore, which speaks not of mystic poetry, but something of Sri Aurobindo's own poetry, which speaks of a direct realization and feeling. This is very rare in Tagore. Nolinikanta Gupta is not wrong, because he is such a great saint, such a great yogi. But sometimes there are exceptions, and even great critics overlook certain things. I think this song is spiritual, not mystic proper. See, I'm reading it out in Bengali, because the rhythm of the original language cannot be transferred to English, but I will make a translation. এই লোভিনু সঙ্গ তব সুন্দর হে সুন্দর, এই লোভিনু সঙ্গ তব সুন্দর হে সুন্দর. I have now got your company, O Lord of Beauty. পুণ্য হলো অঙ্গ মম, ধন্য হলো অন্তর. And there's a rhythm. So Aurobindo says in the future poetry, the rhythm is the most characteristic power of the poet. পুণ্য হলো অঙ্গ মম, ধন্য হলো অন্তর, সুন্দর হে সুন্দর. He has gone across the border. আলোকে মোর চক্ষু দুটি মুগ্ধ হয়ে উঠল ফুটি. My entire being is overflooded with light, because I am inside. I'm not outside the temple and getting the messages. I'm inside, into the light. হৃদ গগনে পবন হলো সৌরভতে মন্থর. And those who are attuned to the rhythm of Bengali verse will understand what it is, how the rhythm is supporting the message. Because in mantric poetry, the inmost saying must be accompanied by inmost expression of the truth. So see how it is. হৃদগগনে পবন হলো সৌরভেতে মন্থর সুন্দর হে সুন্দর এই তোমারই পরশ রাগে চিত্ত হলো রঞ্জিত এই তোমারই মিলন সুধা রইল প্রাণে সঞ্চিত তোমার মাঝে এমনি করে নবীন করে লহে মোরে এই জন্মে ঘটালে মোর জন্ম জন্মান্তর সুন্দর হে সুন্দর this goes beyond all analysis. Even though Tagore is centered in the psychic, this poem shows that he goes beyond the psychic sometimes, tapping the spiritual planes. And of course, I have noted, because I have been long with K.D. Setna. Very few people know that I was for over 2 decades with K.D. Setna, and he taught me like a child all the technicalities of overhead aesthetics. And so I came to know how to characterize what comes from which mind, which plane. Setna taught me, and it was my fortune. Very few people know that, and of course I couldn't use it properly. I couldn't write because of my own negligence and lethargy. But see this line, overpassing of the border, it means that sometimes Tagore has access to the spiritual poetry proper, but basically he is centered in the psychic, because he is best in his prayer songs. Rakho rakho re jibone jibono bollabh, or যদি এ আমারো হৃদয় দুয়ারো বন্ধ রহে গো প্রভু দ্বারো ভেঙে তুমি এসো মোর ঘরে ফিরিয়া যেও না প্রভু. Now this comes from the psychic, and one of its characteristics is sweetness and kindness, a kind of broadness. When the spiritual plane takes up these things, they give it a higher afflatus. But basically Tagore is centered in the psychic, and that makes his poetry so sweet. And this sweetness, it is inherent, and sometimes he gets it from the Vaishnava poets of Bengal. But he doesn't have that austerity of the Upanishads, because he is influenced by the Vaishnava poets. He is sweet. So it is less great, more sweet, and because he is centered in the psychic. But that doesn't mean that he has no access to the higher afflatus. I'll come to that. But once again, repeating, even when he is writing from the psychic, the prayer poetry, the prayer songs, and I am quoting some of the most popular. Aguner porosh muni chhuao prane e jibon punno koro. This is very popular, but I can't avoid this example, because it is very popular and have done some kinds of work on Rabindra Sangit. I can't say that because it is popular I will exclude it. It is a major reference, because it refers to the Rigvedic Agni, which is a purifying force. Now, if you notice, the future poetry comes at the end of the Arya series, just before the foundations of Indian culture ends in 1921. The future poetry ends in 1920. Why is it that it comes so late, and at the same time Sri Aurobindo puts so much of importance to two things, poetry and Sanskrit? Because Sanskrit is not a dead frame of reference. It's a wrong approach, absolutely wrong approach. And unfortunately, if I could meet Sampad in time, then I could have picked up or done my Sanskrit a bit stronger. It is unfortunate because reading Rabindranath and Sri Aurobindo without a very strong knowledge of the Sanskrit is a limitation. So Sanskrit is not a dead frame of reference. It is a means of clarifying and refining our consciousness. It's not a dead frame of reference. It is a means of clarifying and refining our consciousness. It is God's language, God's idiom, God's voice that speaks through it. And Sri Aurobindo places poetry at the center of knowledge. That is why it comes at the end of his great series, The Life Divine, Synthesis of Yoga, Essays on the Gita, The Human Cycle, War and Self-Determination, Ideal of Human Unity, The Foundations of Indian Culture, and closely with it, the future poetry ends as if to indicate that, well, poetry is knowledge. Poetry is the ultimate thing. And he says in a chapter in the future poetry entitled The Ideal Spirit of Poetry, Sri Aurobindo says that philosophy is abstract. Religion takes us to other planes. Only poetry can link the finite with the infinite. Only poetry can link the material and the immaterial. So he has given so much. That is why he says, I am primarily a poet and a politician. It was not accident. It was not a rash comment that he did. Because, in fact, I have read all of his prose, and it is concealed poetry. It is poetry in disguise, the life divine, mostly, although supported by the intellect, but it is poetry. In a chapter, he describes the psychic being, and if you see how he describes the psychic being, the structure starts from two words and it comes to a full, like the pitcher, that the making of a pitcher, and at the end, the entire psychic being is explained. The passage starts with, a guidance, a governance grows from within. And it ends with, all is set to the right key. So in order to realize, understand Sri Aurobindo's poetry, this is my suggestion to all my students and scholars, that there is a wrong conception that if you read the future poetry and the letters, you get the entire aesthetics of Sri Aurobindo. You have to read all the prose works, the life divine. The next is important. Sri Aurobindo sometimes puts the essays on the Gita first, and his advice privately, and also sometimes, I don't know whether he did it publicly, but privately I know his messages. He gave extreme stress on essays on the Gita. There's a reason, but the scope is very short here. I'm speaking of a different thing, not on essays on the Gita. That may be some other day. So this is the point, that he is in between man and rishi. He is based on the psychic, basically. He is a prayer poet. And then we come to that definition which Sri Aurobindo gave after his passing. And that is a famous, oft quoted, everybody knows it, everybody quotes about it. But I have never seen an explanation, because Sri Aurobindo is seldom rash. I say seldom, I should say never. Sri Aurobindo is seldom careless in using words. And he was speaking of a rival poet. He was speaking of a companion poet who once prevented his arrest in 1907 1907, with the poem Aurobindo Robindre Lohonoska. The entire poem was written to prevent his arrest. And there was a very close bond between the two poets. So Sri Aurobindo was careful to give him the right estimate. And you will be surprised that he doesn't focus on poetry as such. He focuses on a thing which many Bengalis reject. And the left critics, they never say God, they never say divine. They mean the divine. They are speaking of Tagore's relation with the divine, but somehow they are ashamed of speaking of the divine. भगवान की बात करना ये शर्म की बात है. This is the attitude of the left critics, and that has marred Tagore criticism in Bengali. When he's speaking of God, when he's speaking of the divine, call it divine. What's wrong? Why you go roundabout and tell it? So he is an aesthete, sure, but he is a whole-time sadhaka. And Sri Aurobindo was the first to mention that he is a whole-time sadhaka. Nobody had spoken of that. They criticized Tagore's life. Well, all of us are small, tiny sadhaks. And Tagore was not a mean sadhak. He was quite a strong, advanced sadhak. And if sadhaka means anyone inferior to Ramakrishna and Sri Aurobindo, of course that is another matter. But Tagore was a whole-time spiritual seeker. And through poetry he was doing that. So Sri Aurobindo said, wayfarer, he was the wayfarer towards the same goal as ours in his own way. And Sri Aurobindo knows there could be many ways. Rabindranath Tagore had many problems, attachments, weaknesses. It is now permissible to speak of his weaknesses. It is now permissible. Because when I am criticizing Sri Aurobindo's poetry, of course I am not criticizing Sri Aurobindo, the avatar of Lord Krishna. X may do that from America because he's a genius, but I'm not a genius, I'm a small man. I can't comment on Sri Aurobindo's life, but I can give my views on Sri Aurobindo's poetry as a student of poetry. So there I am a bit critical, and I think that Tagore was a whole-timer, a whole-time sadhaka, and Sri Aurobindo says, a wayfarer towards the same goal as ours, in his own way. Now, what is this in his own way? Because despite the many weaknesses in Tagore's personal life, there was one central aspiration. He was not distracted from the divine. There were many marriage proposals from girls 30 years, 35 years, 40 years junior to him. Direct marriage proposals. But he was not into it. Bandhan he did not like. And he was a whole-time sadhaka, Sri Aurobindo pointed out for the first time, wayfarer towards the same goal as ours, in his own way. Now what it could be? I suspect it could be music. Because if you read Tagore's songs, his poetry, he once again and again, despite his, apart from his claim that only my music will remain immortal, nothing will remain immortal except for my music. Because these music are related to mantras, incantations, poetry of incantations. At least 1,000 of the 2,000 lyrics. And in his own way, because songs, they arouse the Kundalini. Songs have that power. Song is the soul of poetry, and it has the power to rouse the consciousness, the sleeping Kundalini. So, in his own way, and then Tagore said the exact nature of advance is not that important. Why did he say this? Because he did not like people belittling Tagore, comparing with him. That Sri Aurobindo is an avatar. He's a great spiritual seeker. And they tried to degrade Tagore. So Tagore was careful, because there was a bond between them, a very loving bond between them. This I have noticed, checking their acquaintances, letters, meetings, gestures. There was a bond between them, and said the exact nature of advance is not important, because the mother decides the time. When you reach your destination, mother decides, you can't decide. So what a wonderful gesture from Sri Aurobindo in one sentence. Wayfarer towards the same goal as ours in his own way. And the exact nature of advancement is not that important. So then we come to the point of Jivan Devata. I'm sorry to say that all the critics so far have not only misinterpreted Jivan Devata, but they have distorted it like anything. A vice chancellor came a few years back, he wrote a collection on Jivan Devata. He knows nothing about it. So I keep speaking to them, why don't you read the Upanishads? Because you don't have to be a great Sanskrit scholar to have the essence of Sanskrit. I have Sampad to guide me. If I need any problem, he will be teaching me. You don't have to be great, but you must have a perception of that. You must know the basics of the Upanishads. What is Hiranyagarbha? What is Purusha Antaratma? What is Jivatma? These are the basic things. So there are two ways to understand Tagore, either going by the Upanishads, or if you go by Sri Aurobindo. So Jivan Devata is nothing but that part of the soul that evolves from birth to birth. And the Upanishad calls it not Jivatma, Purusha Antaratma, the psychic being. So this people have taken 100 years and still they do not know that Jivan Devata is the psychic being. Purusha Antaratma. And Tagore is speaking of that this is leading me from life to life. It is clear to us because we have read Sri Aurobindo. And those who have read the Upanishads well, they will know it. The difference between Jivatma and Purusha Antaratma. So this goes. And now let me come to the theoretical framework that Nolinikanta Gupta has explained in his essay, Mystic Poetry and Spiritual Poetry. He says, mystic poetry is on the borderline of truth, and spiritual poetry is the direct vision of truth. And he has given some examples. Tagore is falling towards the mystic side. Some others are there. Mallarme is there. And there are others. And he chooses the Upanishads, Sri Aurobindo Savitri. Naturally, it does not degrade. Poetry is, even if you write, if you do not write of God, of the divine, of integrality, if your imagery is good, if your rhythm is good, it is good poetry. So Rabindranath is a great poet, even though he does not copy the Upanishads, because he is truthful. What he feels, what he knows, he writes. Beyond that, he does not pretend to be a Ramakrishna Paramahansa, because that level is beyond his reach. Whatever is within his reach, he writes. That is his honesty. Now let us come to Sri Aurobindo proper. And this will indicate the differences and also some interesting points. Now, very few people have marked that Sri Aurobindo was influenced by some Tagorean poems. And because Tagore often is very fond of saying the boat came, but I did not respond. I was sleeping when he came. I woke up, then he left. This is a recurring theme in Tagore's poetry. And some of them he translated himself for the Macmillan edition. And the Dream Boat by Sri Aurobindo is a Tagorean poem. It is a mystic poem. It is not a spiritual poem. And it is a mystic poem. And you will see, I can give you many instances when I write it out, I will give you many instances of Tagore writing this. Ami ghumocchilam, tumi eschile tokhon. I was sleeping, you came and you left, but I didn't respond. But there is one thing different in the Dream Boat. You will notice that Sri Aurobindo is very compressed. The two styles are different. The same issue, and Sri Aurobindo was definitely fascinated by Tagore's romantic poetry. These are romantic poems. And Dream Boat is also a romantic poem. But this is something different. Sri Aurobindo has a compression and economy. And if you remember the second stanza of the Dream Boat, you will remember that he says, something in me shuddered. And I don't want to leave the joys of life. So I said no to the gold god. And he left. So this is the tragedy which keeps coming again and again in Tagore's poetry. But in Sri Aurobindo, it takes a new style because it is Sri Aurobindo style, economical, not that loose. If you compare the two languages, talking of Vyasa's and Valmiki's poetry, Sri Aurobindo quotes Coleridge, and he says, when Coleridge speaks of femininity, he means the decorative devices in a language. And Bengali is a feminine language. But see that the contribution of Tagore, he was creating a language because Bankim Chandra had just gave him a model, an outline. A poet who creates an entire language and does all sorts of creativity in that language. What a great achievement. But for Sri Aurobindo, it was easy. Behind him was Shakespeare, Whitman, and the great moderns. So it was easier for Sri Aurobindo because English language was very rich. But Tagore had to make it rich and then create something great out of it. So it's a great contribution, I must say. So this is not to degrade Sri Aurobindo, because yes, English language was prepared before him. He had it ready. Of course, he is a lord of language. I have said at many places, there is no greater event after Shakespeare in the language. Sri Aurobindo and Shakespeare, same status. Same status. Nobody you can place after Shakespeare, only Sri Aurobindo in terms of language. That's why I called him Lord of Language in my primary thesis, the second one. Then there are some Bengali critics who have heard from somewhere that there is something called poetry of silence. They don't know what it is. Maybe they talked to Shishir Kumar Ghosh and they got some idea about it and they wrote without explaining. So in A Amir Abaron, a beautiful book otherwise by Shankha Ghosh, he refers to the poetry of silence, but he doesn't know how to explain it. Because the thing you have to read Sri Aurobindo to do that, or the Upanishads. So this poetry of silence, I will give one instance, two instances from the poem Ascent, which contains two poems in quantitative meter. So I'm quoting the first one. I suspect it speaks of Nirvana, the first one. And you will remember, because you are very learned and you have read Sri Aurobindo very well, he says, Nirvana is the starting point of my yoga. It is not the end point. With Nirvana, I start. And this first poem in the silence is, I think it is the experience of Nirvana of which he is speaking. Let me quote the lines which I remember, 5 or 6 lines. Into the silence, arise, O spirit immortal. Into the silence, arise, O spirit immortal. Away from the turning wheel, breaking the magical circle, ascend single and deathless. Away from the turning wheel, breaking the magical circle, ascend single and deathless. Care no more for the whispers and the shoutings in the darkness. Pass from the sphere of the grey and the little into the silence forever. Now, this is obviously referring to the stage of Nirvana where he wants to ascend. But Nirvana is not Sri Aurobindo's philosophy. In the very next poem, he comes out as a contrast. And he starts the poem out of the silence, because he wants to return to earth. The last canto, the epilogue of Savitri, is entitled Return to Earth, because heaven we have conquered, not earth. So what about the earth? And there are two very striking lines which may be very bare. Spiritual poetry is very bare, of course. It doesn't have that color, that decorative stuff. It is bare, but it speaks all, much in little. Act in this world by being beyond it. Just notice the second poem. Act in this world by being beyond it. And then he says, rise with the earth in thy bosom. Prithivike niye otho. Rise with the earth in thy bosom. Don't desert the earth. So, both of them are attached to earth. Different in style, because the consciousness is also slightly different. The language was different. But there's a similarity in their integrality, in their approach to man, nature, earth, God. They're similar. So, rise with the earth in their bosom. And Tagore said, Ami ei prithibike bodo bhalobashi. I love this earth. Now, this great attachment to earth links the two great poets of India. And there are many similarities between the two. Differences do not matter, in fact. And coming to spiritual poetry proper, I will give some 2 or 3 examples. And I'm not going into the overhead aesthetics because it's a lecture. In a lecture, you shouldn't speak of overhead aesthetics. I can give some clues, but I can't place it before an audience, the subtleties of overhead aesthetics, but I will just touch upon them. So if you see the sonnet Bliss of Identity, which is in Shakespearean form. 12 lines, 4, 4, 4, 12 lines, then a couplet. Then a couplet, Shakespearean couplet, which is the climax. So in Bliss of Identity, Sri Aurobindo has spoken certain things which speaks of a merger. It's not even cosmic consciousness, but a direct knowledge by identity. And I'm just giving you some lines just for your a reminder, because all of you know this. I am a center of the golden light, and I its vast and vague circumference. Thou art my soul great, luminous and white, and thine my mind and will and glowing sense. There is a merger, a complete merger, not cosmic consciousness. Thy spirit's infinite breath I feel in me. My life is the throb of thy eternity. Now, this is not cosmic consciousness. Cosmic consciousness is what rises by the opening of the psychic, it broadens and it embraces the earth. This is something more. Even in golden light, you will see that the light descending, and then it comes to the feet, because the material life is important. Light must touch the earth, so the feet is symbolic. And of course, there are lines which go beyond all analysis, all classifications. So I'll give two examples. One, when Savitri meets Satyavan, Satyavan is speaking to him about how he grew up. And there's a line, fantastic line, because it comes from nowhere. It comes from the infinite and disappears into the infinite. He was describing to his new girlfriend that see is met, that see this was my life. And just a slice he describes in two lines. I caught for some eternal eye, a sudden kingfisher flashing to a darkening pool. I caught for some eternal eye, a sudden kingfisher flashing to a darkening pool. Now, a bad poet would have made it different. They would have written, I caught for some eternal eye, and it flashed through the darkening pool, like that. But the arrangement, the exact placement of words, the unusual cluster, that is part of the incantatory verse and mantric utterance. It's a discovery by virtue of that. Sometimes, as Sri Aurobindo has clarified, Setna also has clarified to me, that even on a mundane subject, why does Sri Aurobindo place Shakespeare at the top with Vyasa, Valmiki, Shakespeare? Sri Aurobindo chooses 11 poets for the utter first class, and he keeps Vyasa, Homer, Valmiki and Shakespeare in the top row. Why? Why Shakespeare? There's nothing to do with spirituality, because the overmind inspiration can touch even the most mundane substance. So there are three things that can happen. The overmind can take up the spiritual substance. It can combine the style and the substance, or it can just fall on a substance which is utterly non-spiritual. This is very curious and interesting. And Sri Aurobindo's instances, so you all know, I don't want to repeat these things. And finally, I have always suggested Book 10, Canto 4 for the syllabus in the English literature of India. All over India, I have suggested this, that Book 10, Canto 4 of Savitri should be in the syllabus. Why? because Rabindranath Tagore was not capable of dramatic poetry. And Sri Aurobindo did all kinds of. Rabindranath Tagore was a master of lyric poetry. And in that field, he is even, I must say, he is better than Sri Aurobindo as a lyric poet. But in variety, Sri Aurobindo is unparalleled. Because here in Book 10, Canto 4, it is dramatic poetry and it shows how great a playwright Sri Aurobindo is. And he has written 5 full-size dramas. Shubham Datta is working on it. He teaches in Goutam College, Kolkata. He's a bright student. Now, this Sri Aurobindo is a dramatic genius and he can write poetry which is drama, poetry, action and emotion at the same time. That happens in Book 4, Canto 4. Just see the tussle between the Lord of Death and the Universal Mother, fighting for the soul of man, for the earth consciousness to be relieved from death. Wonderful. Nothing is written better than this in world literature. It is beyond compare. So we spoke of the 2 poets and I could give you some demonstrations, but in this this kind of communication, when I'm not facing the audience, I wouldn't like to demonstrate how Tagore's lines become mantric by virtue of a typical singing style which Shahana Devi and Suchitra Mitra taught me personally. So I was very careless in those days. I didn't carry my tape recorder. But what I learned is more important for my poetry. If I live, I will try to record those things. Because they taught me how to float the voice while singing. Maybe in another occasion when I'm face to face with you, I will give you some demonstration of what Shahana Devi meant by floating the voice. And this floating the voice has a close link with mantric utterance in Tagore's poetry. So this is about the 2 poets, two great poets. Sri Aurobindo is, I think, slightly less attractive in lyric, but in variety, of course, because he's an epic poet. Tagore is not an epic poet. This is not to degrade Tagore, because he is also one of my darlings. So, and I personally sing Tagore songs a lot, and I demonstrate. So, I can't degrade any of the 2 gods. But you have to be critical. You have to see. It's not criticizing Sri Aurobindo's life as someone has done, as X has done. Because I'm a small man and I don't think anybody under the sun has any access to Sri Aurobindo's inner life. And that book was written in a total satirical style. Imagine a biography written in satire. I can't think of it, but I am speaking of his poetry. So I am given some scope to speak, because if I don't criticize his poetry, people won't discuss him outside the world. It will be confined to our own place, Pondicherry and Shantiniketan. It won't go to the outside world. We have to criticize. And as Goethe has said, criticize we must, but on bended knees, because we must remember, even when we are criticizing their poetry, they are Sri Aurobindo and Rabindranath. We have to be careful about our words. Finally, about the Rose of God, which is a major poem by Sri Aurobindo, and it is one of the greatest things he has done. He wrote it a bit early, perhaps, if I am not mistaken, it was in 1932 or 1934. Somebody may correct me. But by that time, Sri Aurobindo was clear about the about the descent of Mahashakti on earth to transform the earth consciousness. And it was, as a poem, it is marvelous. And it is so subtle, the 17th ecstasies of heaven, it relates to the Veda. But if you even don't think of Bhuva, Swaha, Maha, Jnana, Tapa and Satyam, the 17th ecstasies of heaven. Deshpande, if Deshpandeji is listening, I will be ashamed of it, because I'm not supposed to speak on Savitri when he is here. But still, Rose of God is, it can serve 10 reputations. If he wrote that single poem, Sri Aurobindo would have been famous. And what a great image at the end and in the last stanza. A blush of rapture on eternity's face. What is Rose of God? A blush of rapture on eternity's face. What an image, my God. A blush of rapture on eternity's face. And here is a genuine poet, denied because we are too far below his consciousness. That is the problem. While, but it's better to even criticize, even abuse, not his personal life, which someone has done. Unpardonable offense. Because at the back of my mind, I know who he is. He's not a man. But his poetry, I will take him as a man writing poetry. There I can do some things, some observations here and there, some objections, as Setna used to give. And Sri Aurobindo used to say, no, leave it like that, because Setna was overcritical. So that's all for today. And if there is any question, I will answer.